It was a very impressive talk, despite your disclaimers. I thought it was extremely well done, and it left me with a lot of residual thought about something that we touched upon this morning, which is the where does responsibility begin in the molestation and ultimately the destruction of civilians. At risk of repeating something I said this morning, I suppose it won't matter, will it, if I mentioned the fact that Kurt Vonnegut was talking about this unbelievable atrocity of the destruction of Dresden, unprecedented in modern times. Joe Heller pointed out that the killing of, privately, that the killing of civilians is an ancient habit, that the Bible is filled with episodes of the destruction of civilians, as is a lot of the literature of antiquity, but that in modern times, up until World War II, civilians were off limits. You can comb the literature of the Civil War, that most horrible of wars, and you will find virtually no descriptions of any real harm to civilians. Isolated cases, to be sure, and occasionally a situation in which maybe a single civilian was mistreated badly, but that the idea of civilians being harmed was almost sacrosanct. The Franco-Prussian War, it was a similar event. That was, next to the Civil War, was the largest 19th century conflagration. And you find that civilians are off limits. You then proceed to World War I, where the same situation applied. There were random stories of the Germans famously butchering Belgian children. This turned out to be a fantasy. It was not true. It was propaganda on the part of the Allies. Civilians, once again, were off limits. The critical moment came when Kurt mentioned Guernica. And this is an interesting proposition, the idea that the first recorded moment in strictly modern history of the harming of civilians was at Guernica. And then after that comes this extraordinary acceleration of the slaughter of civilians. After Guernica comes the firebombings of London, Manchester, Coventry, and our retaliation in kind in Dresden, and then of course the extraordinary firebombings of the Japanese mainland, Nagoya, Kobe, Tokyo, where hundreds of thousands were destroyed, and culminating, of course, in the most famous of all destruction of innocent people, being Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm merely bringing this up as food for thought, because I think it is a fascinating component of our modern history that whereas soldiers and sailors were often at each other's throats, ever since the Middle Ages, people who we have come to call civilians have not been objects of firepower and destruction. And I'd like to, I'm bringing this up because I think that possibly it might be a food for thought in a few minutes when we throw open the conversation to a general overview.
Thank you. Mr. Heller?